If you're listening to this, you're probably the kind of person who likes to really dig into things. Like, what's the deal with, well, everything,
Yeah.
you know? And that's exactly why we do these deep dives.
Right, yeah, it's not enough to just scratch the surface. We want to go deep, unearth the ideas of thinkers who, might not be household names, but whose work was so influential. And today, we're talking about one of those thinkers.
Someone who really laid the groundwork for so much that followed. Think of it like sharpening your philosophical tools by like examining a master craftsman's work.
And the master craftsman we're looking at today is John of Salisbury, a really important figure in the 12th century Renaissance. And his influence, I mean, it touched on so many areas: political theory, moral philosophy, education. He was even involved in bringing Aristotelian thought into the mix, a real polymath.
Wow. Okay, so a major player in the history of ideas then.
Yeah.
And for this deep dive, we're relying on a really comprehensive source, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on John of Salisbury.
Yeah, this entry, it's fantastic. Goes into detail about his life, his influences, his key philosophical ideas, and how those ideas played out in practice.
A great roadmap for our exploration then. So, what's the mission here? What are we trying to do with this deep dive?
Well, we want to bring out what's most philosophically interesting and relevant about John of Salisbury, especially for you, the listener, who's already thinking about these big questions. Our goal is to give you, like, a solid understanding of his core ideas and how they all connect.
So, let's get started. Who was this John of Salisbury and what kind of experiences shaped his thinking?
So he wasn't just some, like, ivory tower scholar. He was born in England around 1115 or 1120 and got a really top-notch education in Paris. He studied with some big names like Peter Abelard, and then he went into service for the church, becoming the secretary to Archbishop Theobald of Canterbury.
So, not exactly a quiet, contemplative life then.
No, not at all. He was right in the middle of the action. And, he later became the Bishop of Chartres. But before that, he was caught up in some major controversies. The big one was the conflict between Archbishop Thomas Becket and King Henry II. John actually ended up exiled for a few years because of it.
Wow, so you're saying these real world political and religious clashes probably had a big impact on his philosophy.
Oh, absolutely. Seeing firsthand how ideas played out in the real world, how power struggles worked, how the church operated, all of that must have shaped his views on things like governance, justice, and authority. I mean, imagine the insights you'd gain from that kind of experience.
I can only imagine. Now, the encyclopedia entry really emphasizes his deep connection to classical philosophy. So, what were his intellectual roots?
Okay, so this is fascinating, especially from a philosophical perspective.
Yeah.
He was super into classical thought, even though at that time in the Latin West, they didn't have a lot of original Greek sources.
Yeah.
They had limited access to the works of Plato and Aristotle.
So, how did he engage with those ideas?
Well, he relied on Latin writers and translations. And there was these things called florilegia, which were basically collections of excerpts from classical works,
Hmm.
like ancient philosophical anthologies. Imagine trying to piece together a philosophy from bits and pieces like that.
Wow, that's quite a challenge. But he did have some direct access to certain authors, right?
Right. His personal library included works by Cicero and Seneca. And Cicero especially had a huge influence on him, not just on his writing style, but on his whole approach to philosophy.
His skeptical method, right. The entry talks about his adoption of Ciceronian moderate skepticism from the New Academy. For those of us who appreciate philosophical subtleties, can you break down what that means?
Sure. So the New Academy, it was a school of thought that had a more, let's say, reasonable take on skepticism compared to the Old Academy. The Old Academy, those guys were hardcore. They were like, we can't know anything for sure.
Radical.
Yeah. But the New Academy, they said, hold on, we don't have to go that far. They rejected this idea of dogmatic certainty, the belief that we can have absolute infallible knowledge. Instead, they focused on probable truth. So they said, look, human reason, the best it can usually do is get us to a high degree of probability.
Okay, so not saying knowledge is impossible, just that we need to be careful about claiming we know things for sure.
Exactly. And even those beliefs that seem super well supported, they should still be open to revision. Like, if new evidence comes up or someone presents a really good argument, we should be willing to change our minds. That's what Cicero argued. He said, sure, our senses can trick us, and it's not always clear what the criteria for truth are, but that doesn't mean truth is completely out of reach. The key is to stay open-minded, not be dogmatic, and constantly test your beliefs.
So kind of like a humble, ongoing process of critical thinking.
Exactly. And John of Salisbury, he was all about that.
Where do we actually see this commitment to moderate skepticism in his own writings?
Oh, he spells it out pretty clearly. Like in his in Syntheticus Mare, he critiques the super extreme skeptical view that humanity is just stumbling around in the dark.
Hmm.
He sides with the new academy. He says, we should be cautious, yes, but experience can give us probable truths.
So not throwing out all of our knowledge, just being careful about what we claim to know.
Right. And he often uses phrases like, I believe or I think it to be, especially when he's talking about stuff that's not, absolutely certain.
Interesting how those little word choices can reveal so much about a philosopher's thinking.
Totally. And in his Metallogicon, in the prologue, he straight up says, I'm an academic when it comes to things that are open to doubt. He's cool with probability. He even uses this metaphor that Cicero used about truth being hidden at the bottom of a well.
So he's acknowledging that finding truth is difficult.
Yeah. And he thought that the dogmatism he saw in some of his contemporaries, that was a real problem. Like, people being so sure they were right, it was blocking genuine intellectual progress.
So for him, skepticism wasn't about giving up on knowledge, but about creating a better environment for finding it.
Absolutely. Be humble, be open-minded, keep questioning. That's how we get closer to the truth. And this commitment to moderate skepticism, it really leads into another big theme in his work, which is super relevant for us as philosophers: moderation itself.
Moderation. The entry uses the terms modestia and moderatio. So how does his view of knowledge connect to this idea of balance?
Well, if you accept that absolute certainty is often out of reach, then you kind of have to cultivate what he called a modest mind, a mind that's not making big dogmatic pronouncements, a mind that's aware of its own limitations and the possibility of being wrong. Like he says in the Syntheticus, a modest mind is careful about what it claims.
So intellectual humility is a consequence of skepticism.
Exactly. But for John of Salisbury, moderation wasn't just about being a good thinker. It was about ethics and politics, too. Like in his Metallogicon, he argues that education has a moral dimension. He says knowledge is only good if it leads to virtuous living.
So knowing a lot of stuff doesn't make you a good person. You have to live by what you know.
Right. He thought the way you acquire knowledge should be ethical, too. So intellectual moderation, in this broader sense, it means being choosy about what you study, not just chasing every new idea that comes along, and balancing your intellectual work with rest and reflection. He wasn't a fan of the endless debates that were happening in some of the schools at the time. He thought they were often unproductive.
A warning against intellectual gluttony, maybe.
Yeah, I like that.
Uh-huh.
And this emphasis on balance, it carries over into his Polycraticus, where he gives advice to people in power. He talks about how moderation applies to life at court, even to things like enjoying sensual pleasures. You can enjoy those things, but in a temperate way, not to excess. He saw it as a way to recharge, not to indulge.
So kind of a practical application of the Aristotelian idea of virtue as a mean.
Exactly. He thought virtue was about finding the middle ground between extremes. Even being overly zealous about good deeds could be a problem. He uses this analogy of straying to the right or left. You can be too fanatical about certain virtues, like going overboard with it can be just as bad as not being virtuous at all.
Sounds like he had a really nuanced view of ethics.
He did, and he got this framework from Cicero, where the context really matters. He said you have to consider the time, the place, the amount, the person involved, and the reason for the action. So what's virtuous in one situation might be completely wrong in another, like taking a human life. Obviously, that's wrong in most cases, but it could be justified as a punishment or in a just war. So his ethics were circumstantial. He took the context seriously, but still believed in objective moral principles.
Okay, that makes sense. And it seems like this idea of moderation was super important for his political philosophy too, especially when it comes to his idea of the ideal ruler.
Right. In the Polycraticus, he says the best ruler is one who uses both justice and mercy, but in a balanced way, to create harmony in the realm. And then he contrasts this good ruler with the tyrant, who only cares about himself and doesn't care about the well-being of his people.
The classic good king versus bad king scenario, but moderation is what makes the difference.
Exactly. And this is where his famous analogy of the body politic comes in. He got this idea from a letter supposedly written by Plutarch to Trajan. Basically, he compares the state to a living organism. Each part has a specific job. The clergy are like the soul, the prince is the head, the senate is the heart, the judges are the senses, and so on, all the way down to the workers who are like the feet.
So it's hierarchical, but everyone plays a part.
Right. And the point isn't just about hierarchy. It's about how everyone needs to work together. He talks about a unity of wills, everyone aiming for the common good. And the health of the whole body politic depends on everyone acting justly.
What happens when things go wrong? Like when a ruler stops being moderate and becomes a tyrant?
Well, this is where his theory of tyrannicide comes in. It's a pretty controversial idea even today. Basically, he says that if a tyrant is totally destroying the state and twisting justice, then it's okay to remove that tyrant, like as a last resort. He justifies this based on the idea that the community is like an organism, and if one part is diseased, you have to cut it out to save the whole body. But, he wasn't advocating for just any random act of violence. This was about a reasoned response to extreme oppression.
That's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Now, the encyclopedia also mentions his critique of what he called anti-Epicureanism. He saw it as a form of immoderation. Can you tell us about that?
So John of Salisbury thought Epicureanism was the opposite of moderation. He got most of his ideas about Epicureanism from Latin writers like Cicero, who were pretty critical of it. But here's the interesting thing. He distinguishes between Epicurus himself and his later followers. He thought Epicurus's original ideas about pleasure weren't necessarily bad, like the focus on avoiding pain and finding tranquility. He thought that could be moderate.
So he's making a distinction between the founder and how his ideas were interpreted later on.
Yeah, sort of. He thought the problem was with the later untrammeled hedonism, like people just pursuing pleasure without any limits. He thought that kind of behavior leads to moral corruption and weakens society. And he didn't just use the label Epicurean for actual followers of Epicurus. He used it more broadly for anyone who was driven by their desires and lacked self-control. Like even tyrants could be Epicureans, in his view.
Because they're putting their own gratification above everything else.
Exactly. And he argued that this constant chase for pleasure, for wealth and power, it doesn't actually make you happy, it just makes you exhausted and leads to pride, which he saw as the root of all evil.
So his critique of Epicureanism is another way of emphasizing the importance of moderation.
Absolutely. And this connects to another key aspect of his thought, his naturalism.
Naturalism. So how did he see the natural world influencing society and politics?
He believed that social and political structures have a natural basis. He talks about this in both the Metalogicon and the Paldocraticus. In the Metalogicon, he argues against these guys, called the Cornificians. They believe that humans are basically limited to their innate abilities and that reason and language aren't that important. They emphasize divine grace instead.
So a debate about nature versus grace.
Right. And John of Salisbury says, no, God gave us the ability to improve ourselves through reason and language. He uses Cicero's ideas to describe how society developed gradually. He says humans have this natural tendency to form communities and work together. And language is crucial because it allows us to share our thoughts and persuade others.
So he's saying society isn't just some artificial thing we made up. It's rooted in our nature.
Exactly. And he says something similar in the Polacriticus where he writes, nature is the best guide to living. But he also says that we have to work at it. Nature gives us the potential, but we have to develop our abilities through practice and discipline.
So nature provides the foundation, but we have to build on it.
That's it. And for John of Salisbury, all of this philosophy had a practical purpose. He didn't just want to think about these ideas in the abstract. He wanted to use them to live a good life and make the world a better place.
It sounds like he was kind of a philosopher king himself, advising rulers, getting involved in politics and church affairs.
Yeah, he was definitely a man of action. But his actions were guided by his philosophical beliefs. And you can see his philosophy even in his personal letters and his writings about history and saints. His friend Peter of Cell said his letters were seasoned with philosophy.
So philosophy wasn't just a separate thing for him, it was part of his whole life.
Exactly. He truly believed that real happiness doesn't come from material things, but from wisdom and virtue. He thought philosophy had the power to change us, to guide our choices, and lead us to a good life, both in this world and the next.
So for our listeners who are into philosophy, what are the big takeaways from John of Salisbury's work?
Well, I'd say there are a few key things to remember. First, his skepticism. It's not about rejecting knowledge altogether. It's about being humble, asking questions, and being open to changing your mind. Second, his focus on moderation. It's not just an intellectual virtue, it's an ethical and political virtue too. Third, his view of society as an organism. It emphasizes cooperation and working together for the common good. And finally, his belief that philosophy should be practical. It should guide our actions and help us live better lives.
It's amazing how relevant these ideas from the 12th century still are, and what's something that our listeners might want to ponder based on John of Salisbury's work.
Well, considering how much he emphasized moderation, it makes you wonder, how would he view the philosophical debates we have today? where people often have such strong opposing views. We think that we're lacking that modest mind, that we need to be more open to different perspectives.
That's a really good question. So, if our listeners want to explore John of Salisbury's ideas further, what should they read?
I definitely recommend checking out his two most famous works, the Polycraticus and the Metalogicon. Reading his own words, you get a much deeper understanding of his thinking. And it's really fascinating to see how these ideas from the Middle Ages can still speak to us today.
Thanks for taking us on this deep dive into John of Salisbury's philosophy. It's a reminder that the search for wisdom is an ongoing conversation, and we're all part of it.